Chapter 4, Job Costing. In this, we've got two presentations in this chapter, and in this one we're going to get through all the background stuff, like building block concepts, distinguishing job costing from process costing, describing approaches to evaluating and implementing job costing systems, the 7-step approach to normal costing, and then distinguishing actual costing from normal costing. And these are all the learning objectives we're going to do. In the second presentation, we'll start out with tracking the flow of costs in a job costing system, then disposing of over and under allocated overhead, and variations from normal costing. Okay, so the second piece has most of the computational items in it, and the first one is mostly background. So in this slide, we're reviewing some terms from prior chapters. The cost objects are anything for which a cost measurement is desired, and that could be a department or a product or an entire product line or a division. It could be a lot of different things. Direct costs of a cost object are costs that can be traced to that object in an economically feasible way. Indirect costs cannot be traced economically feasibly. Okay, so direct costs are more or less traceable, and indirect costs are not. And this is where all of our problems are, is how to allocate those indirect costs. Now here we've got some additional terminology. A cost pool is a grouping of individual indirect cost items in a cost allocation base. Okay, it's a method by which we can link a cost pool to a cost object. These concepts, the concepts that we just reviewed, constitute the building blocks that we use that for everything that we're going to do in this chapter. Now, costing systems. In cost accounting, we study two different types of costing systems, job costing and process costing. In a job costing system, the cost object is a unit or multiple units of a distinct product or service, which we're calling a job. Okay, and each job generally uses different amounts of resources. Whereas in a process costing system, the cost object is masses of individual or similar units of a product or service. Think paper towels, okay, toilet paper. Those are all masses of individual or similar units. In this type of system, we divide the total cost of producing an identical or similar product or service by the total number of units produced to obtain a per unit cost. Now, in a service situation, you might have a department in a dentist office that just cleans teeth. Okay, so the tooth cleaning people could almost be costed in a process costing way if they just do that all day long, if you could isolate the cost just of that one unit. Okay, but they should be similar, identical or similar masses of products, okay, or services. Now this is a good slide. This slide provides some examples of the types of businesses that may use a job costing system versus process costing. And remember, the distinguishing characteristic is what's being produced. In a typical job costing system, we're producing distinct units of a product or service, and in a product costing system, process costing system, we're making masses of identical or similar products. Okay, so many companies operate with elements of both systems that are tailored to the underlying operations. So what you're learning here are really two methods that both can be changed in different ways. Okay, so let's look at some examples here. Job costing would be used for audit engagements, okay, consulting engagements, okay, advertising agency campaigns, legal cases, okay, computer repair jobs done by CompUSA, movies produced by any studio. Okay, so if you're going to produce a movie, the cost of producing that movie would be a job cost. Okay, for merchandising, LL Bean's individual items sent by mail order. Be pretty tricky to cost that, I would think. A special promotion of new products by Walmart. job costing. We have to see what the costs were involved in there to really understand how we're looking at that. Manufacturing center, assembly of individual aircraft. Okay, an aircraft at Boeing would be a job cost. Construction of ships, that's a job cost. Constructing of railroad cars, okay, those are all job costs for a particular railroad. Now, process costing, these are good examples. You can see how different they are. Bank check clearing operations, postal delivery, okay, just standard items, okay, grain dealing, or the lumber dealing by Weyerhaeuser. Oil refining by Shell, that one I can see. Beverage production, milk production, those to me are clear. There's some good examples in the material that was assigned for my lab to practice to figure this out, so you get an idea of, you know, what it's, where to draw the line. Now, care must be taken to properly distinguish between the allocation process for actual costing and normal costing. Okay? Now, actual costing allocates actual indirect cost, okay, that rate times the actual quantities of the cost allocation base. Okay? Whereas normal costing allocates costs based on a budgeted indirect cost rate. Okay? Like a predetermined overhead rate times the actual quantity of the cost allocation base. Okay? The rate's determined using the budgeted quantity, but once you've got it, you use the actual quantities to allocate the cost. And both methods allocate direct cost to a cost object the same way, by using actual direct cost rates times actual consumption. Okay? We'll practice these, though, so we can really get a good idea of those. And here's a chart that summarizes it. Let's look at the normal costing. I mean, this is all actual, okay? Actual rates times actual quantities for both direct and indirect. For normal costing, direct cost is the same, okay? Actual rates times actual quantities. But for indirect costs, we're going to use budgeted indirect cost rates. Make this a different color. Okay? Budgeted indirect cost rates times actual quantities. So that's what the difference is here. And then we've got a 7-step process for job costing. The first one kills me. Identify the job. Okay, identify the direct cost of the job. So first we've got our job. The direct costs are the cleanest. And then select your allocation base used for allocating the indirect cost. Okay, oops. Compute the rate per unit for each allocation base used. Okay, and then compute the indirect costs. All right, but it's a lot easier when you've got a job, when we've got an actual example and we go through this. Now, the last thing in here is to compute total job costs by adding all the direct and indirect costs together. There's a framework used to assign the cost to an individual job using normal costing in step 7. And what we're going to do is, first of all, debit direct manufacturing costs and credit direct material and direct labors. So this is your direct manufacturing cost for the job. Then we're going to debit a manufacturing overhead and credit a bunch of indirect costs. Okay? So, and that's going to be an allocation. Direct costs aren't traced, but indirect costs are allocated. Okay? Did I say that right? Direct costs are traced? Yeah, okay? And then indirect costs are actually not traced, but they're allocated to the job. Now, as we learn from this slide, the only difference between actual and normal costing is the way rates are calculated to allocate indirect costs. Okay, it's only the indirect cost. In normal costing, we use budgeted indirect cost rates, whereas in actual costing, we use actual indirect cost rates. If we're using actual cost rates, we've got to wait till the end of a year and to get the rates. Okay, and that's why so many companies use normal costing, where they estimate it at the beginning of the year, and use like a predetermined rate for the year to allocate the overhead. And this is a decent exhibit. It's a graphical representation of the job costing overview. So we have, first of all, an indirect cost pool, and our allocation base is they're going to use direct labor manufacturing hours. And I'll tell you, we frequently use things like this because it's the data that we have, okay? You've got access to direct manufacturing labor hours. There might be better drivers to use, but you've got to capture them, okay? Whereas direct labor hours, we actually have that. That gives us $40 per hour, okay? So the cost object is specialized machinery, and we're going to allocate, first of all, direct materials. Those are direct costs and direct manufacturing labor, and they're going to go to along with the overhead that we allocate. Okay, one more slide here. This is the flow of job costs in a job costing system that we looked at, similar to before, and this breaks up the process between the balance sheet and the income statement. Okay, the upper section illustrates the flow of inventoriable costs, from the purchase of materials and other manufacturing inputs to their conversion into work in process and finished goods, and finally to the sale of the product. The lower section indicates the flow of the period costs, marketing and customer service costs. Okay, they just end up over here in the income statement. These costs do not create any assets in the balance sheet because they're not incurred to transform materials into a finished product. Instead, they're expensed in the income statement as they are incurred to best match revenues. And that's kind of a tricky question because some marketing expenses really benefit a future that might be a year off. So now that we've seen an overview, in the next section we'll take a look at the journal entries that we use to record each transaction.